Imagine standing alone in the freezing December cold of 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. You're a 19-year-old American private, clutching a Browning automatic rifle with barely enough ammunition to last 5 minutes in a firefight. Behind you, your entire company has retreated across a narrow bridge, the only escape route for thousands of Allied soldiers. And in front of you, pause for effect, the rumble of diesel engines grows louder. Through the snow-laden pines, you see them, the unmistakable silhouettes of German Panzer tanks, at least a dozen of them, accompanied by hundreds of Wehrmacht infantry. They're part of Kampfgruppe Piper, one of the most feared armored battle groups in the entire German military, spearheading Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. You have two choices: run and save yourself, abandoning the bridge that stands between the Germans and tens of thousands of retreating American troops, or stay and attempt the impossible. This is the true story of Private Martin James, a farm boy from Iowa who made a decision that day that would alter the course of one of World War II's most critical battles. His weapon wasn't superior firepower or brilliant tactical training. It was pure, audacious bluff, the kind of desperate ingenuity that defined the American fighting spirit in the darkest days of the war. December 16, 1944. The date lives in infamy for those who know their World War II history. The Germans called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. Over 500,000 men would be engaged in combat. Nearly 20,000 Americans would die. But on that morning, as German artillery began pounding American positions along an 85-mile stretch of the Ardennes front, none of the frontline GIs knew they were about to face the full fury of 3 German armies, nearly 250,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks thrown into a last-ditch offensive designed to split the Allied armies in two and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Adolf Hitler himself had planned this operation in absolute secrecy. He'd stripped the Eastern Front of precious reserves, gambling everything on one massive surprise attack through the impossible Ardennes forest, the same route his armies had used to devastating effect in 1940 when they conquered France. German intelligence had identified this sector as weakly held, defended primarily by Green American divisions fresh from the States, or battle-worn units sent there to rest and refit. The weather forecast promised low clouds and fog that would ground Allied air power. Everything seemed aligned for a German miracle. Everything except the determination of the American soldier. Private Martin James was part of Company C, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, the Checkerboard Division, as they called themselves after their distinctive shoulder patch. The 99th had only arrived in Europe that November. Most of its men had never seen combat. They'd been assigned to what everyone assumed was a quiet sector of the front, perfect for breaking in new troops. The men dug foxholes in the frozen ground, strung communication wire between positions, and tried to stay warm in temperatures that plunged below freezing every night. Some of the veterans from other units joked that this was a rest cure compared to the brutal fighting that had characterized the drive across France and into Germany during the autumn. Martin James was typical of these men in many ways. Born and raised on a corn and hog farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he'd been drafted in the spring of 1943, shortly after his 18th birthday. His father had served in the First World War and had instilled in young Martin a sense of duty and patriotism that was common in that generation. America had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. America was fighting for freedom against tyranny. There was never any question that Martin would serve when called. He'd trained at Camp Maxey in Texas, learning infantry tactics, how to fire the M1 Garand rifle and the heavier Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, which would become his assigned weapon. The BAR was a beast of a gun, weighing nearly 20 pounds loaded, capable of firing 30-06 Springfield rounds in either semi-automatic or full automatic mode. It took strength to carry it, discipline to fire it accurately, and courage to be the man wielding it, because BAR men drew enemy fire like magnets. But all the training in Texas, all the practice exercises and mock battles, nothing had prepared Martin or his buddies for the reality of combat. And certainly nothing had prepared them for what was about to happen on December 16th. The German artillery barrage began at 5:30 that morning. Martin was asleep in his foxhole, wrapped in every layer of clothing he owned, plus a thin wool blanket, when the first shells began falling. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a screaming, tearing noise, followed by massive explosions that shook the earth and sent fountains of frozen dirt and shattered trees into the air. Searchlights suddenly illuminated the low clouds from behind German lines, creating an artificial moonlight, which the Germans called artificial moonlight, a psychological weapon designed to disorient and terrify. For 90 minutes, the shelling continued without pause. Men huddled in their holes and prayed. Some prayed to survive. Some prayed for courage. Martin James, according to his own account recorded years later, prayed for his mother back in Iowa. When the barrage lifted, the German infantry came. Thousands of them, gray uniformed figures emerging from the foggy forests like ghosts. And behind them, the tanks. The Americans of the 99th Division fought with desperate courage. These green troops, supposedly unprepared for real combat, held their positions far longer than German planners had anticipated. They made the enemy pay for every yard of ground. But they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. By noon, Company C was receiving orders to fall back. By mid-afternoon, they were in full retreat, trying to reach secondary defensive positions several miles to the rear. This is where our story truly begins, because between Company C and safety stood a narrow stone bridge across a half-frozen stream called the Amblev River. The bridge was barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass, but it was the only crossing point for miles in either direction. If the Germans captured that bridge intact, they'd have a clear route to push deep into the American rear areas, potentially encircling thousands of troops. Someone had to hold that bridge long enough for Company C and elements of several other units that were converging on the same escape route to cross. Then, someone had to blow the bridge. The company commander, Captain Robert Hendricks, a pre-war National Guard officer from Pennsylvania, reached the bridge with the remnants of his company, maybe 70 men out of the 180 who'd been on the line that morning. Behind them, German tanks could be heard getting closer. Hendricks knew he had to get his men across, but he also knew he couldn't just blow the bridge immediately. Other American units were still falling back through the forest. Intelligence reports, sketchy as they were in the chaos, suggested hundreds of GIs were trying to reach this crossing. The captain made a decision. He'd get most of his men across, rig the bridge with explosives, and leave a small rearguard to cover any stragglers and blow the charges at the last possible moment. He called for volunteers. In the brutal calculus of war, this was likely a death sentence mission. The rearguard would be outnumbered at least 10-1. They'd face tanks with nothing but small arms and maybe a bazooka or two. Their odds of survival were minimal. Captain Hendricks needed 3 men. 12 stepped forward. Among them was Private Martin James. Years later, when asked why he volunteered for what seemed like certain death, Martin gave an answer that was quintessentially American in its modest simplicity. "Someone had to do it," he said. "I figured I was as good as anybody, and I kept thinking about all those other guys still trying to get back to our lines. They deserved a chance." Captain Hendricks selected 3 men, Sergeant Bill Morrison from Texas, a veteran of the fighting in Normandy who'd been transferred to the 99th as a replacement, Private First Class Eddie Kowalski from Chicago, a tough kid who'd grown up in the stockyards, and Private Martin James. Morrison would be in command. Their orders were simple: hold the bridge approach, let any American stragglers across, and blow the bridge when German tanks get within 200 yards or when it became clear no more Americans were coming. Combat engineers rigged the stone bridge with enough TNT to drop the center span into the river. They ran the detonator wire back to the western side where Morrison's little team would make their stand. The rest of Company C crossed the bridge and took up positions on the far side, but they'd be pulling back almost immediately to regroup further west. Morrison, Kowalski, and James were on their own. The three men positioned themselves behind a thick stone wall that bordered the road leading to the bridge. Decent cover, but hardly a fortress. They had their rifles, one BAR, carried by Martin, 2 bazookas with 6 rockets total, and maybe 500 rounds of ammunition between them. And they had the detonator, a simple plunger device that, when depressed, would send an electrical charge down the wire and blow the bridge. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The sound of German vehicles grew louder, but nothing appeared on the road. Then, out of the forest, a group of American soldiers emerged. Maybe 20 men from various units, wounded, exhausted, some without weapons. Morrison waved them through. "Novit, get across! Go, go!" The Americans stumbled past, giving thumbs up or grateful nods to the 3 men who'd stayed behind. More time passed. The winter sun, which had barely risen above the horizon on this short December day, was already sinking toward the west. Darkness would come early, around 4:30. It was nearly 3 o'clock. That's when they saw them. First one, then another, then an entire column of German Panzer tanks. Mostly Panzer IVs with their distinctive long 75mm guns, but also several of the newer, heavier Panthers, massive 45-ton monsters with sloped armor that could shrug off most American anti-tank weapons. The tanks were accompanied by infantry riding on the hulls and walking alongside. This was Comp Group Piper, or at least a battle group from the same formation. Crack SS troops who'd been specifically chosen for this offensive because of their aggressive tactics and proven combat effectiveness. They'd been driving westward all day, crushing American resistance, and now they'd found this bridge. Their ticket to exploitation and breakthrough. Sergeant Morrison grabbed his binoculars. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "There's gotta be 12, 15 tanks, and at least 200 infantry." He looked at Kowalski and James. Both men had gone pale, but both nodded. They knew what had to happen. They'd wait until the Germans got close, use the bazookas to try to knock out the lead tank, maybe kill some infantry, buy some time for any last American stragglers, then blow the bridge and run like hell, hoping to escape in the chaos and confusion. But then something happened that changed everything. The German column stopped. About 400 yards from the bridge, the tanks halted and the infantry dismounted. Through his binoculars, Morrison could see German officers walking up and down the column, pointing toward the bridge, gesturing and apparently arguing. "Why'd they stop?" Kowalski whispered. Morrison shook his head. "Don't know. Maybe they're suspicious. Maybe they think we've got anti-tank guns zeroed in on the bridge." Martin James, lying behind his BAR, suddenly had an idea. A crazy, desperate, probably suicidal idea, but an idea. "Sarge," he said quietly, "what if we make them think we've got more than we do?" Morrison looked at him. "What do you mean?" Martin's farm boy mind was working. "Back home, when coyotes would come around the chicken coop, my dad taught me a trick. You make a lot of noise in different places. Make them think there's more of you than there really is. What if we make them think this bridge is defended by more than just 3 guys?" Morrison started to understand. "You mean Fire from different positions? Make them think we've got a whole platoon here? Martin nodded. And not just fire. Call out orders. Make it sound like we're coordinating multiple guns, multiple positions. Germans speak some English, right? Maybe they'll hear us and think twice. Kowalski grinned despite the terror he felt. It's crazy, but hell, what have we got to lose? For the next 10 minutes, the three Americans put on a performance worthy of Hollywood. Morrison ran to a position 30 yards north, fired a burst from his M1, then shouted at the top of his lungs, "Second squad, hold your fire until they hit the bridge. Machine gun team, you got that flank covered?" There was no second squad. There was no machine gun team. But the Germans didn't know that. Kowalski moved south, fired his rifle, then yelled, "Bazooka team, ready on my mark. Anti-tank guns, wait for my signal." Martin stayed in the center with his BAR and did something brilliant. He fired short bursts, 3 to 4 rounds, then stopped, moved 15 feet, and fired again. Then moved again, and fired, each time from a different position. The BAR's distinctive sound, a slower rate of fire than a true machine gun, but still automatic, echoed across the frozen landscape. To the Germans watching from 400 yards away, it sounded like multiple automatic weapons. And Martin kept shouting, "Third platoon, stay in position. First platoon, shift to the southern approach. Captain says hold this bridge at all costs." Captain, the magic word. If there was a captain commanding this position, that meant at least a company-sized element, 100 or more men. Martin ran back and forth behind the stone wall like a madman, firing his BAR from different spots, shouting orders to imaginary units, making as much noise and chaos as possible. Morrison and Kowalski did the same, coordinating their movements and their shouts to create the illusion of a well-defended position with multiple squads, heavy weapons, and determined leadership. The Germans, watching this display, saw muzzle flashes up and down the American position. They heard the BAR fire. That meant American automatic weapons, plural in their minds because the fire seemed to come from multiple points. They heard officers shouting orders about platoons and companies. And most importantly, they saw that the Americans weren't running. They were staying to fight. Why would 3 men stay to fight against overwhelming odds? They wouldn't. But a reinforced company with orders to hold this bridge at all costs? That made sense. That was exactly what the German officers would expect the Americans to do at a critical choke point like this bridge. Through his binoculars, Sergeant Morrison watched the German officers conferencing. One pointed to the woods on either flank. Another gestured back the way they'd come. They were discussing options. Do we rush the bridge and risk heavy casualties from entrenched defenders? Do we try to find another crossing? Do we call up artillery to soften the position first? Every minute they debated was another minute that the bluff worked. Another minute for American forces further west to establish better defensive lines. Another minute of precious time bought by 3 men and their desperate theater. Then Martin had another idea. "Sarge, we should fire the bazookas." Morrison looked at him like he was crazy. "We only got 6 rockets. We save those for when they actually attack." But Martin shook his head. "No, listen, we fire 1 at that lead tank. We probably won't hit it at this range, but that's not the point. The point is, we show them we have anti-tank weapons. That'll make them even more careful." Morrison thought about it for maybe 3 seconds, then nodded. "Do it." Kowalski grabbed one of the bazookas, loaded a rocket, and took aim at the lead Panzer IV. The range was long for a bazooka. These weapons were really only effective at 100 yards or less, but accuracy wasn't the goal. Kowalski fired. The rocket whooshed across the space between the American position and the German column, trailing smoke. It missed the tank by 20 yards, exploding harmlessly in the snow. But the effect on the Germans was immediate. The entire column buttoned up. Tank commanders ducked inside their turrets, hatches clanged shut, infantry scattered for cover. They'd just been engaged by anti-tank weapons. That changed the entire equation. German doctrine emphasized combined arms tactics and careful preparation when facing prepared defensive positions. Rushing headlong into anti-tank fire was a recipe for disaster. The German officers knew this. They'd seen what happened to unsupported armor in Normandy, in France, in the Hürtgen Forest. American defenders with bazookas, anti-tank guns, and artillery support could turn a narrow approach like this bridge into a killing ground. And now they'd just confirmed that the Americans here had anti-tank capability. The German officers made their decision. They'd call up artillery, pound the American position, then assault with infantry while the tanks provided covering fire from a distance. It was the textbook approach. It was also time-consuming. The Germans began digging in. Some of the infantry started setting up mortars. The tanks repositioned into a defensive formation. Martin, Morrison, and Kowalski watched all this with a mixture of disbelief and hope. It was working. The bluff was actually working. But they all knew it couldn't last forever. Eventually, the Germans would attack. Eventually, the three of them would have to blow the bridge and run. The question was, how much time could they buy? Darkness began to fall. In December this far north, twilight was brief. By 4:30, it was nearly full dark. This complicated things for both sides. The Germans couldn't assault effectively in darkness without preparation. The Americans couldn't see to defend effectively. But darkness also meant opportunity. Morrison made a decision. We keep up the show for another hour. Make noise, fire occasional shots, keep them thinking we're here in force. Then, soon as it's full dark, we blow the bridge and get the hell out. Head west, try to link up with our lines. For the next hour, the three Americans continued their performance. Every 10 or 15 minutes, one of them would fire a few shots toward the German position. They kept shouting orders to phantom units. Martin even had Kowalski light small fires behind their position at different points, making it look like multiple warming stations for troops, another indication of a larger force. The Germans, now fully expecting a tough fight come morning, settled in for the night. They'd resumed their attack at first light with proper artillery preparation. That's what their commanders decided. That's what made tactical sense. At 6 o'clock, 3 hours after first engaging in their desperate bluff, Morrison gave the order. Time to go. Martin, you blow the bridge. Eddie and I will cover you. Martin crawled back to where the detonator sat behind the stone wall. His hands were shaking. From cold, from adrenaline, from the sheer mental and physical exhaustion of the last 3 hours. He'd been running back and forth, firing his bar, shouting until his voice was hoarse, all while knowing that at any moment the Germans might call his bluff and charge. But they hadn't. The bluff had worked. He put his hands on the detonator plunger, said a quick prayer, and pushed down hard. The explosion lit up the night like a small sun. 300 pounds of TNT detonated simultaneously, blowing the center span of the stone bridge into rubble that crashed into the partially frozen river below. The sound echoed across the valley. From the German position came shouts of alarm and surprise. They'd been so focused on preparing for tomorrow's assault that they hadn't seriously considered the Americans might destroy the bridge. After all, why would a defending force destroy its own infrastructure if it planned to counterattack? But of course, the Americans weren't there in force. There were only 3 men. 3 incredibly brave, incredibly clever men who just pulled off one of the most audacious bluffs in World War II history. Morrison, Kowalski, and James ran. They ran west through the dark forest, stumbling over roots and frozen ground, not daring to use flashlights, just moving as fast as they could away from the now alerted German force. Behind them, they could hear German voices shouting, vehicle engines starting up. But the bridge was gone. The easy route west was denied. The Germans would have to find another way, and that would take time, hours, maybe a full day. Time that could mean the difference between breakthrough and containment. Time bought by 3 American soldiers with almost no weapons, no support, and nothing but raw courage and a desperate bluff. The 3 men made it back to American lines just before midnight, nearly dying when nervous GIs almost shot them as they stumbled out of the darkness calling out passwords. They were immediately taken to battalion headquarters, where a shocked intelligence officer debriefed them. When Martin James explained what they'd done, how they'd convinced a German battle group that included at least a dozen tanks and hundreds of infantry that the bridge was heavily defended, the officer at first didn't believe him. But Morrison and Kowalski confirmed every detail. And, more importantly, the bridge was blown and the Germans hadn't crossed. That was all that mattered. The immediate tactical impact of Martin James's bluff was significant. The German battle group that had been stopped at the bridge was delayed by more than 12 hours in finding an alternative crossing. This delay was part of a larger pattern across the northern shoulder of the Bulge, where the Green troops of the 99th Division, along with other American units, fought with unexpected tenacity and skill, disrupting German timetables and buying crucial time. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, and the outcome would ultimately be an Allied victory. But it was a close-run thing, decided by hours and miles in those first critical days. Every bridge held, every road blocked, every hour of delay imposed on the German offensive made the eventual American victory possible. But the broader significance of Martin James's action goes beyond the tactical. His story represents something fundamental about the American soldier in World War II, an ingenuity, a refusal to quit even in hopeless situations, and a willingness to take risks that often caught their enemies by surprise. The German military was in many ways more professional, more experienced at the operational level of war. But the individual American GI, often a civilian soldier like Martin James who'd been drafted from a farm or factory, brought qualities that couldn't be trained or drilled: initiative, flexibility, and a democratic spirit that encouraged even privates to think creatively and act decisively. This was the genius of the American military system in World War II. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the German Wehrmacht or the Japanese Imperial Army, American forces encouraged initiative at every level. Sergeants were expected to think like lieutenants. Privates were expected to step up when situations demanded it. This wasn't always the case in the peacetime army, but in the crucible of combat, American commanders quickly learned to trust their men and give them the freedom to make decisions. When Captain Hendricks called for volunteers to hold that bridge, he didn't pick the men himself. He let them volunteer, trusting that the right men would step forward. And they did. Martin James survived the war. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions at the bridge, though typically the modest farm boy from Iowa never talked much about it when he returned home. He went back to Cedar Rapids, took over his father's farm, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children. He died in 1998 at the age of 73, having lived a quiet, decent life that gave no outward indication of the extraordinary courage he'd shown one December evening in the forests of Belgium. But the men who served with him knew. The officers who planned the defense of the northern shoulder knew. The historians who later analyzed the Battle of the Bulge knew. One bridge among dozens along that 85-mile front. One delay among many. But wars are won by exactly these kinds of actions: small unit leadership, individual bravery, and the refusal to surrender even when surrender seems like the only rational choice. The Germans had every advantage that December. They had surprise, they had numbers, they had elite troops and better tanks. What they didn't account for was the American soldiers' capacity for desperate improvisation and the kind of audacious bluff that Martin James pulled off that day. There's a broader lesson here about American military effectiveness that's worth considering. From Valley Forge to Gettysburg, from the Argonne Forest to Iwo Jima, from the Chosin Reservoir to the streets of Fallujah, American forces have repeatedly found themselves in situations where they were outnumbered, outgunned, or surprised by enemy action. And repeatedly, individual soldiers and small units have risen to the occasion, using whatever means necessary, firepower when they had it, but just as often cleverness, bluff, and sheer determination, to hold the line until reinforcements could arrive or defenses could be organized. This is part of the American military tradition, and it's a tradition that Martin James exemplified perfectly. The Battle of the Bulge would end in complete Allied victory by late January 1945. The German offensive, which had initially pushed American forces back 40 miles and created a dangerous bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name, was ultimately contained, then reversed. American forces counterattacked, retaking all lost ground and inflicting devastating casualties on the German army that it could never replace. The Luftwaffe burned through its carefully hoarded fuel reserves in futile attempts to support the ground offensive, losing hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed, and with it any realistic hope that Germany could avoid total defeat. But in those first chaotic days, when German tanks were racing westward and American units were fighting desperate delaying actions all along the front, individual acts of courage like Martin James's bluff made all the difference. Historians have calculated that the German offensive fell behind schedule by almost 48 hours in the first week due to unexpectedly stiff American resistance. 48 hours doesn't sound like much, but in warfare, time is everything. Those 48 hours allowed American commanders to move reinforcements, including the 101st Airborne Division, to the critical crossroads town of Bastogne and the 82nd Airborne to the northern shoulder. Those reinforcements would anchor the defense that eventually stopped the German advance. And that defense was made possible by men like Martin James, who bought time with their courage and their cleverness. There's also something poignant about the fact that most of the men who held the line in those first days of the Bulge were from units like the 99th Division, green troops who'd barely seen combat. The veterans, the experienced divisions, were mostly further south or were rushed to the battle only after the crisis became apparent. It was these green kids, teenagers many of them, who bore the initial onslaught of 3 German armies. And they didn't break. They bent, they retreated when necessary, but they never panicked and they never stopped fighting. Units like the 99th Division would later be recognized as having saved the northern shoulder of the Bulge, preventing German forces from breaking through to the vital supply dumps and road networks that lay behind the American front. And within those units, individuals like Martin James performed acts of extraordinary heroism that multiplied the effectiveness of their units many times over. So when we think about World War II and American victory, we should think not just of great generals like Eisenhower and Patton, not just of vast industrial production and technological innovation, not just of strategic bombing and amphibious invasions, though all of those mattered enormously. We should also think of Private Martin James, standing behind a stone wall with a BAR and a crazy idea, convincing an entire German battle group that they faced a force 10 times larger than reality. We should think of Sergeant Morrison and Private Kowalski, supporting that bluff with their own courage and quick thinking. We should think of all the anonymous GIs who held impossible positions, who volunteered for suicidal missions, who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved their buddies and believed in the cause they were fighting for. That's the American story in World War II. Not just victory, but how that victory was achieved. Through the efforts of millions of individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who did their duty even when that duty seemed certain to cost them their lives. The greatest generation, as they've been called, earned that title not through propaganda or myth-making, but through countless acts of courage, large and small, from Normandy to the Rhine, from North Africa to Berlin. Martin James's bluff at the bridge was one small act in a vast global conflict. But it was also everything that mattered. One man, in one moment, making a choice that defined who he was and what his country stood for. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you or taught you something about the Second World War that you didn't know before, please consider subscribing to this channel. We're dedicated to bringing you the untold stories of World War II, the individual acts of heroism and clever bluffs that changed the course of battles and campaigns. These stories deserve to be remembered. The men and women who performed these acts deserve to be honored. And by learning about their courage, perhaps we can find inspiration for our own challenges, whatever they may be. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us next time for another incredible tale of personal heroism from the Second World War. Until then, remember, sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is stand his ground when every instinct screams to run. And sometimes the smartest thing a soldier can do is convince his enemy that he's much stronger than he really is. Private Martin James did both. And in doing so, he became part of the immortal tradition of American arms, the tradition of the citizen soldier who rises to the occasion when his country needs him most.